everybody to Ice Age Europe Day. So we're really excited because this is the first Ice Age Europe Day we've done in person. So I'm Angharad, I'm the curator. We have Andrea, who is a heritage facilitator, and Hannah, who is also a heritage facilitator. So we're going to start with 3 talks and then time for a question and answer session. Okay, so I'm going to start then talking about the Ice Age mammals of Europe. Now I'm going to just be outlining what the Ice Age is. So the Ice Age is sort of a common term for what's known as the Pleistocene. And the Pleistocene began 2.6 million years ago and ended 11.7 thousand years ago. And then after that point, we have a period known as the Holocene, which is the warm period we're in today. So this graph here shows changes in temperature during the Pleistocene. And the peaks in the graph are warm periods or interglacials, and the troughs are glacials or cold periods. So you can see that even though it's called the Ice Age, there was actually a lot of fluctuations in temperature. And then this is sort of a zoomed in graph of temperatures of the past 300,000 years. And you can see we've got a warm period and then a cold glacial period, but there's all these sort of jagged areas in the graph. And those are what's known as stadials and interstadials, so shorter term, cooler and warmer periods. And these are just 2 artist reconstructions of what Creswell Crags might have looked like at 2 points during the Pleistocene. So on the left-hand side, we've got 125,000 years ago, so the last interglacial. And then on the right-hand side, we've got roughly about 14,000 years ago, so the late glacial period. And I'll be talking about differences in the environment at different points later on. Okay, so Ice Age mammals then. So 2.5 million years is a long time. Europe is a big continent, and we've had lots and lots of mammals in Europe during that time. So this is just a very, very brief overview of mammals in Europe during the Ice Age. So I'm just going to start off by just naming a few mammals. So the carnivores then. So this lovely looking one on the left-hand side is a hyena. So it's debated whether it's a spotted hyena, the same species that lives in Africa today, or a cave hyena, or a subspecies. But that one was present all over Britain and a really important species, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. There are 2 other species of hyena, Pachycruta brevirostis and Pereri, Pachycruta pereri. And then we also had, it's just at the back, thank you. And then we also had some cats. So we had probably one of the more famous carnivores, sort of the saber-toothed cat or the scimitar-toothed cat. We had lynxes, such as this jaw there. And we also had canids as well, so wolves, and dogs were domesticated towards the end of the Ice Age. And then we also had more common species that we might be more familiar with in Britain, such as the red fox and its counterpart, which now lives in more northern areas, the Arctic fox. And we also had mustelids, such as badgers. And in terms of the herbivores, I think probably the most famous is the woolly mammoth shown here, but there are a few other species of mammoths as well, such as Mammuthus meridionalis and Mammuthus trogontheri. We had elephants as well, like the straight-tusked elephant. We had woolly rhinoceroses and narrow-nosed rhinoceroses. We had loads of deer species, so giant deer, reindeer, red deer, and horses as well. And then we can't forget about the small mammals, and they sometimes get a little bit ignored, but they're also really important. So we had lots of rodent species, so lots of different vole species, lemmings as well. We had lagomorphs, so we had mountain hares and things like the steppe pika here, so related to hares and rabbits, but it's got little ears. We had things like shrews and smaller mustelids, such as stoats and weasels. So there were a whole load of different species across Europe at different times. Some of them are still alive today. Some of them still live in Europe today, some don't. So I'm just going to be talking about why there were so many changes in groups of species in Europe. And I'm going to be talking about 3 main reasons. I'm going to be talking about evolution, migration or range changes, and total extinction or local extirpation. So evolution, first of all. So the first evolution I'm going to be talking about is the evolution of the water vole. So in the early middle Pleistocene, there was a vole species, a water vole species called Mimmis savini, and that had rooted teeth. And over time that evolved into articular Kantiana, and that had unrooted teeth. And this is a really key and really useful adaptation because unrooted teeth grow over time. So the life of the waterfowl is not limited by its teeth wearing down and it being unable to eat. And then there were further evolutions in the waterfowl during the Middle Pleistocene from Arvicula kantiana terrestris to Arvicula terrestris terrestris. And that included differences in the length of the first lower molar, so this tooth on the right-hand side there, and also changes in terms of where the thickness of the enamel was and changes in terms of different sizes relative to other parts of it. And this is a really key evolution in terms of us understanding ages of deposits, because we can see if we get one of these later vole species, we know it was sort of the later Middle Pleistocene rather than the earlier Middle Pleistocene. And then a really interesting study of evolution occurs on islands. So during the Pleistocene, with all these changes in temperature, ice sheets expanded and contracted, and along with this, sea levels rose and fell. So sometimes individuals were able to get onto islands, and then when the sea levels rose, they got stranded on the islands. And these individuals within these small populations of islands sometimes underwent evolution. So large mammals tended to become smaller, and smaller mammals such as rodents tended to become bigger once they were trapped on islands. And sometimes these size changes were so extreme that the individuals on the islands were classed as a new species, so they underwent evolution. And there are various theories as to why these size changes took place, such as changes in predation pressure, changes in competition, changes in the food and food availability that they were eating, or even changes in the size of the islands themselves. So one example is Paleoloxodon Falconeri. So this was an elephant that was found on islands such as Malta and Sicily, I believe. And this is a really nice illustration. So we've got the human there, which is probably 1 meter, 75 centimeters. And then we've got the adult male elephant shown there, and that was just over 1 meter in height in terms of like its foot to its shoulder, so absolutely tiny. So if you think of massive elephants today, imagining those small individuals, and that was an adult male, so the calves would have been even smaller. And then this size change also took place in mammoths as well. So the smallest mammoth that has been found is Mammothus creticus, found on the island of Crete, and that was almost as small as that elephant I showed on the previous slide. So really, really tiny mammoth. And this also occurred in species such as hippos and some deer species as well. And then we've got a rodent here. So we have the gigantic dormouse, which was found on the island of Sicily. So these images here, we've got in the silvery ones, that's a composite 3D model of a gigantic dormouse made up of fragmented cranial specimens found in this one cave in Sicily. This golden skull is a 3D model of the garden dormouse, which is assumed to be the closest relative to the gigantic dormouse. So you can see, oh, you can't quite see the one at the bottom. Unfortunately, there's a silhouette at the bottom of the Thank you. There we are. You can see the tiny silhouette at the bottom. So you can see just how much larger the gigantic dormouse became relative to the garden dormouse after it got isolated. So as well as overall size changes, there were differences in the morphology of the skull. So the snout was a bit shorter in the gigantic dormouse relative to the garden dormouse. Its zygomatic arches, so sort of the bits going around its eyes, were more triangular in shape. Its brain case was a bit narrower, but it's the area where the skull articulates to the first vertebra was slightly larger. And the authors determined that this might have been due to two different things. It might have been due to a change in the food that the gigantic dormouse was eating, or it might have been just the fact that some of the skull features might have had to have changed in size to be able to sort of function properly as this much larger individual. So migration then. So with these changes in temperature, species changed the range that they lived in. So when it warmed up, species that preferred warmer temperatures were able to migrate north in Europe. And one of the really key areas in understanding this migration is Britain. So Britain was sometimes connected to mainland Europe, and it was sometimes an island. And because of the changes in sea level, we have quite distinctive groups of mammals living in Britain at different times during the Pleistocene. So I'm just going to be talking about three different groups of animals. So we've got 300,000 years ago, we had species such as the macaque, the giant beaver, two different rhinoceros species, the narrow-nosed rhinoceros and Merck's rhinoceros, the straight-tusked elephant and horse. 125,000 years ago, so that circle in the middle, was another warm period. We had narrow-nosed rhinoceros again and straight-tusked elephant, but we also had species like hippopotamus and red deer and hyena living in Britain. But interestingly, there were no horse and no human species living in Britain at that time, and that was despite the fact that they were found elsewhere in Europe. So it thought that horse and humans didn't manage to get back into Britain before the sea levels rose again. And then we've got the middle of the last glacial period, roughly around about 50-ish to 28-ish thousand years ago, we had hyena again, but then we've got some colder adapted species because it's sort of not full glacial conditions, but fairly cool. So we've got woolly mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, bison, and reindeer. And this is when we had Neanderthals and also early modern humans in Britain as well. And then this is just a study looking at small mammals in the southwest of France. And they found that at different points towards the end of the Pleistocene, there were different groups of species. So during the colder periods, the sort of more cold adapted small mammals like lemmings tended to become more abundant. And during the slightly warmer periods, especially towards the Holocene that we're in today, there were larger groups of warm adapted species. And then there were sort of those intermediate groups when it was not really cold, but not really warm. Okay, what time is it? Quarter past, cool, that's fine. Okay, so extinction and extirpation then. So scientists are constantly learning more and more and more about why species might have become extinct or disappeared from Europe during the Pleistocene. And this is to do with a few different reasons. One of which is that more studies have taken place. So we might find more specimens of an individual, and then we might date them and find that they were present later than we thought. There's also advances in methodologies, such as a few years ago, towards the early part of the 21st century, there was a better method for doing radiocarbon dating that got rid of more of the impurities. So our radiocarbon dates are more accurate. And then another method which has come about quite recently is environmental DNA. So this is taking DNA not from bones and teeth, but from sediments such as lake sediments, cave sediments, or permafrost. And two studies just published last year were looking at environmental DNA, and they suggested that the woolly rhinoceros and the woolly mammoth actually survived for much longer than was thought just by dating the bones of animals themselves. Because we'd be really, really lucky if we found the bone or tooth of the last individual of a species that ever lived. But I'm just going to be talking about one example, which is hyenas, so this spotted or cave hyena. So this study looked at why spotted hyena disappeared from Europe. And to do this, we sort of gathered radiocarbon dates from all over Europe and grouped them into different areas, such as Northwestern Europe, Central Europe, Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, and Southwestern and Southeastern Europe. And once we'd done that with the hyenas, we did the same for their prey species, so red deer, reindeer, and woolly rhinoceros. And then we also looked at things like what the temperature was like. And it seemed like hyenas disappeared from different areas in Europe at different times. So they disappeared from Central Europe first, and then from Northwestern and Eastern Europe, and then more southern areas. And it seemed to be different influences in different areas in Europe. So some influences included the loss of a key prey species, such as the woolly rhinoceros. Other causes included the temporary absence of species such as reindeer and red deer. And then other influences included a period of quite cold conditions. And interestingly, in Eastern Europe, this might have been compounded by competition with species such as cave bear. So hyenas denned a lot in caves during the Pleistocene, and they're quite prevalent over most of Europe. But in Eastern Europe, it seems, just from looking at the literature, that there were more occurrences of cave bear dens than hyena dens. So it might have been in Eastern Europe. They were outcompeted for caves, and if it got really cold, then maybe they didn't have enough places to shelter, and this might have influenced their disappearance from the area. Okay, so mammal assemblages then. So how do we know so much about the mammals? Where do we find them? So the first one is, again, hyenas. So I said they're found in caves. So we find the remains of the hyenas themselves. So this is Eric, which is our juvenile hyena that we've got upstairs. So you've got free entrance to the exhibition today. So if you want to pop up there at lunchtime, you can see Eric. And then we also find evidence of the adult hyenas, as well as their coprolites, so fossilized poo, and the evidence of their prey as well. Birds of prey are also a key reason why we find lots of mammal remains in caves. So birds of prey tend to eat small mammals such as voles and the pika, which is the one on the right hand side there. Then they vomit them up in their pellets. And if you're really lucky, this can build up over time in quite high concentrations, and then you find lots and lots and lots of small mammal remains, bones and teeth in a cave assemblage. Humans also deposited bones and stuff in caves, but I'm not going to be talking about that because Hannah is going to be talking about humans. And then we've got caves such as Pitfall Traps. So this illustration on the left-hand side is actually a Spanish cave from the Miocene, but I quite like the illustration. So essentially what's happened is a white rhinoceros has fallen into the cave from the hole in the top. A carnivore, I think that might be a cave lion, has gone, tasty food, falls into the cave as well. And over time, there's layers of sediment and the bones of animals that have fallen into a cave building up over time. And one example of that is Joint Mintner Cave in Devon. And then we also find remains of mammals on open air sites. So there's a really key sequence of river terraces along the old route of the River Thames, including Trafalgar Square. So if you dig down in Trafalgar Square, you might find some hippos. And there's another site called Linford in Norfolk, which was an old river channel. And we find lots of evidence of Neanderthals there and also species like mammoths. So I'm just going to quickly go through some example sites. So Goya Caves in Belgium. So Goya Caves is a really, really complex site. And in that site, we find evidence of carnivores, their prey, and humans. And interestingly, we find that the human remains and sort of the bones that they damaged are found more towards the front of the cave, and then the carnivores such as the cave bear and the hyena are found more towards the rear of the caves. And this is the same as in Techoneres Cave in Spain. So this was a study where they plotted things like the halves, so fire pits made by humans, the lithic scatters, the bones damaged by humans, but also carnivore remains and bones damaged by carnivores such as hyenas. And they found similar to Goya Cave. So the halves were found towards the front of the cave, so this lighter green area, and the concentrations of other human evidence seem to be concentrated around these fire pits, and then sort of became more dispersed further out. And then the remains of the carnivores tended to be found all over, but in slightly higher concentration towards the rear of the cave, so sort of the lighter green area there. And then we've got Medvedje Cave in Slovakia. So another species we had, another carnivore species was the cave lion. And the authors looked at some lions in Medvedia Cave, and they reconstructed the body mass of the lion, and they reconstructed it to be about 300 kilograms. This was 300 kilograms of an adult male lion. And from what I can see from the literature, most of the adult lions that live in Africa today are less than 200 kilograms. So this was a really, really massive individual from Medvedia Cave. And then we've got Baronica Cave in Serbia. This was another hyena den site. So the image on the right-hand side is a piece of hyena coprolite, so their fossilized poo. And what scientists can do is to extract pollen from that coprolite, and that can tell us about the vegetation that was around when the hyenas were depositing their poo. So from the coprolite, scientists found that the vegetation was quite open grassland. And also at the site was a load of small mammal species as well. So we've got stuff like the water vole, bank vole and field vole, and some lemmings. So the scientists looked at the environmental tolerances of those small mammals, and they used that to reconstruct the environment. And it suggested that it was quite a cold period because most of the mammals were more tolerant of sort of cooler conditions, and there was no evidence of animals that prefer warm conditions. Okay, that's the end. So thank you very much. Obviously, it was a whistle-stop tour of mammals in Europe during the Pleistocene because there was a lot, but I hope I did them a little bit of justice.
Right. In that case, let's get started. So good morning, everybody. My name is Hannah, and I'm going to be talking to you today about Ice Age people, both here at Creswell Crags and in the rest of Europe, since this is Ice Age Europe Day. Now, I could well focus on more than one species of human. I'm only going to focus on two today because there are so many. I'd be here for ages if I talked about all of them. So I'm going to be talking about Neanderthals and modern humans, or Homo sapiens, who are the two species who were here at the Crags during the last Ice Age. Now, I will be explaining a little bit more about when they were here in a bit more detail later on, but suffice to say this presentation should basically cover who they are, what they're doing here at the Crags, and how they connect us here to the rest of Europe. So where was I? We were at Neanderthals, weren't we? So as I said, they existed as a distinct species between about 400,000 and 40,000 years ago. But since then, they disappeared, they went extinct. And initially, scientists believed that they went extinct because modern humans outcompeted them when they moved out of Africa about 40,000 years ago. But actually, through the magic of modern science, we're beginning to understand that the picture is far more nuanced than that. And actually, we did this study in 2010 where scientists managed to sequence what we call the full Neanderthal genome. And all that means is that they extracted enough Neanderthal DNA from fossils all across the world to reconstruct their whole genetic code. And then they could compare that genetic code with ours today. And actually, they found that if you're from Europe, if you're born in Europe, between 2 to 4% of your DNA actually comes from a Neanderthal, meaning that not only did they not go extinct in the way we originally thought, but that humans and Neanderthals can't be separated that easily. We are them and they are us. And so scientists kind of panicked at this point, and they went, oh no, that whole Neanderthal stereotype where we thought they were really stupid and violent, they can't be anymore because they're part of us, and that would mean calling ourselves all of those things. So we've kind of spent the last 10 years, ever since that discovery, re-evaluating their archaeology to look for things we might have overlooked initially when we did our first analyses. And we've pretty much found since then that they can do all of the same things as modern humans can. Now, a lot of the bits that prove this, the artifacts and objects, were found in Europe. So I'm going to start by taking us to Europe. I'll give a kind of wider context for what Neanderthals were doing, tying into a couple of other sites in the Ice Age Europe network, and then I'll move on to explaining what on earth they were doing here at the Crags. So we'll kick off with a lovely map. I've got red sites and black sites. The red sites are part of the Ice Age Europe network. The black sites are sites which are not part of the network, but I think are key for understanding Neanderthals in Europe. So I'm going to talk about both today. I'm going to start with one in the Ice Age Europe network called Kleiner Feldhofer Cave, or as it's marked on the map, it's number 4, the Neanderthal Museum. And I start with this because it's where the very first Neanderthal remains were recognized as being a new species of human in 1856. Now, the beauty of hindsight allowed us to see that we'd actually found Neanderthals before then, in 1829 in Belgium, in a cave called Engis, and then later on in 1848 in a place in Gibraltar called Forbes's Quarry. But it wasn't until the 1856 skull was discovered in Germany that we realized we were dealing with a different species. And this was then classified in 1864 as Homo neanderthalensis by Dr. William King, after the Neander Valley in which they were found. And I mentioned this one because I think it's really key in showing how important the skeletons of Neanderthals are in how we understand them. So sometimes the skeletal remains we find were isolated, especially in the beginning, like at Feldhofer, like at Engis and Forbes's Quarry. But since then, we've been finding much more complete Neanderthal skeletons in what we now know are Neanderthal burials, because the preservation conditions in burial tend to be a lot better than when you just find isolated scattered remains. So a couple of those are marked in black. La Ferricie, La Chapelle-aux-Saints and Le Moussier are really key European sites, but Shanidar, Kibara and Tabun, all down in Eurasia, are also really key Neanderthal burial sites where we find lots of individuals. And these really tell us the basics about Neanderthals, because from skeletons, we can extrapolate things like their height, like their build, their stature, that sort of thing. We can also look at the kinds of traumas and diseases they were facing, kinds of thinking about the lifestyle they might have been having. And even we can learn things about Neanderthal diet, especially when we are lucky enough to find intact teeth, because we can analyze the DNA in what we call the dental calculus. Now, that's basically just hardened plaque. So the stuff that you get on your teeth if you don't brush them enough. So thank goodness Neanderthals didn't have toothbrushes, because by looking in their dental calculus, we can learn that they were eating small and large game, but also that they were exploiting plant materials for both food and medicinal purposes as well. And in fact, there's a really cool site called El Cedron in Spain, which is number 4 on my black sites there, where when we analyze the dental calculus of the Neanderthal individuals, 2 of them only had proteins in their calculus from plants. So technically, we think they were vegetarians. So a very far cry from that kind of club-toting, meat-eating Neanderthal of just about 10 years ago. Now, that dietary variation isn't just limited to sites like El Cedron, though. It's evident from Neanderthals all across Europe, and even boils down to them exploiting things like seafood and other marine resources when we're lucky enough to find Neanderthal coastal sites. So we get a whole different picture of Neanderthal complexity from what we had before the genome sequencing. Burial also does this, though, irrespective of the skeletal remains. It tells us about Neanderthal complexity in that it suggests things like social structure, like care and compassion for the individuals people were burying. And also it suggests they had the capacity for abstract symbolic thought, which we didn't believe they could do until very recently. And that is also evident through their relationship with powerful birds, which is very odd, and which I'm going to talk a bit about now, because this kind of ties into my own research and also a couple of sites in the Ice Age Europe network. Now, all this is that Neanderthals appear to have been exploiting raptors and corvids, or crows, birds of prey, for their feathers and talons all across Europe, from between about 125,000 to about 40,000 years ago. And these are typically non-practical elements. You can't eat things like talons, so they must have been exploiting them for a different reason. And this behavior repeats as well. Like I said, it's a big pattern. So the longevity of that tradition and how widespread it is, to me, suggests that it was some kind of cultural tradition, maybe, possibly tied up with some kind of Neanderthal identity. So I'm going to draw your attention to 2 case studies from Ice Age Europe. If I skip back to my map, I'm going to take you first to Italy, to Fremont Cave, to talk about the Neanderthal exploitation of feathers. And then we're going to move over to Croatia at a site called Crepina, where they were taking eagle talons. And hopefully that should give you a basic idea of what on earth they were doing with birds in the Ice Age. So we'll start in Italy at Fremont Cave. And here, archaeologists found in a layer associated with Neanderthals the remains of 22 different birds. Now, these were dominated by raptors, so think eagles and falcons and vultures, but they also found remains of corvids like alpine chough too, all birds with very typically dark feathers that are really, really nice and glossy. So maybe there's a colour preference going on there as well. We don't really know. Now, what was really interesting about these 22 birds is that they were largely represented by wing bones. And of course, wings are not particularly good to eat. There's not very much meat on them. So the archaeologists working on the site realized that they were probably exploiting them for something else. So they thought, what else is on the wings? Well, of course, it's the feathers. The wings are where your primary flight feathers are, the most beautiful, longest, and most impressive feathers on a bird. So they figured they were targeting these feathers. And originally they believed maybe that was for practical reasons, for things like fletching arrows or balancing spears. However, that kind of fails as an interpretation, because not only did Neanderthals not have bows and arrows, there's no point in them exploiting feathers for arrows, but they don't really need them to balance spears either, because where we're lucky enough to find examples of Neanderthal spear technologies, like at Clacton in Essex or Schöningen in Germany, they're so well balanced already that feathers would just throw them off. So archaeologists then had to think outside the box and look at what else people would use feathers for. And they boiled down basically to the idea that maybe they're being used for some kind of decoration on clothes or bodies. Now we're going to move over to Crepina in Croatia now, because this site, where they're exploiting eagle talons, then takes that idea of Neanderthal body decoration a little bit further. And this site's really special because they've got 8 different talons from white-tailed sea eagles. So a massively impressive, huge raptor, sometimes described as a flying barn door, if anybody is curious as to what they might look like. And so these talons, there are 8 of them, but they're from 3 or 4 different birds, so suggesting some kind of planning or forethought in making this object. And the fascinating thing about them is that they're all kind of polished and abraded along the edges. And that suggested to archaeologists that they were being strung at one point in time, and that the polish was caused by the talons all knocking together and rubbing off the hard outer sheath. So they did some more analysis on this because this sounded really interesting. And in 2020, a paper was published where they looked in depth at one of the talons, and actually they found pigment on it. So red and yellow ochre, and possibly a little bit of black pigment as well, which is basically a Stone Age paint. And they also intriguingly found a little piece of twisted animal collagen, or animal string potentially, from when this object might have been strung as maybe a necklace or a bracelet, or even possibly as some kind of rattle or musical instrument, because of course the talons would make a sound when they knocked together. So all of that really changes, again, our picture of Neanderthal complexity. Suddenly they're making jewelry and they have this strange connection with these raptors and corvids. So my research then went into looking at why this might be the case. Why are they choosing to exploit these birds preferentially for their feathers and talons over all other species? So I was looking at things like what modern hunter-gatherers were doing with these birds and at the behaviors of the birds themselves to see if I could work out why there was a unique connection between them. Now, first of all, Neanderthals would have been really familiar with raptors and corvids because they are scavengers in the bird world, and Neanderthals would have been killing a lot of their prey. These birds may have flocked to their carcasses, so they would have been interacting with each other quite a lot. But there are some interesting behavioral parallels between the two as well. So for example, raptors, they migrate in huge numbers. They would have been visible across parts of the Neanderthal range, probably while Neanderthals were on their own migrations. That could have fostered a very similar kind of cohesive connection there. Raptors are also really powerful hunters at the very top of the food chain, just like Neanderthals would have been. And corvids, if you're looking at why they might be special, they're particularly intelligent, they're particularly social, and perhaps that was mimicking the kinds of interactions that Neanderthals were having with each other as well. So lots of interesting behavioral parallels which might suggest why there's some kind of symbolic connection, we think, between Neanderthals, raptors, and corvids. Now this becomes even more fascinating when you bring in other evidence though. So when you look at modern hunter-gatherers, because when you look at modern hunter-gatherers' cosmologies, religions, myths, and legends, tends to be raptors and corvids that are front and center in those when birds are present, because of those attributes of power and intelligence and those behavioral parallels which I mentioned. So it's really not implausible that the roots of these traditions actually began with the Neanderthals, and that like modern hunter-gatherers, They're expressing how they feel about these raptors and corvids and expressing that connection through the exploitation of feathers and talons. So perhaps they're using feathers to embody or transform into birds, a little bit like this picture. Maybe they're exploiting talons to harness some kind of hunting prowess, or perhaps more broadly, it's all to do with expressing that blurred nature of identity between humans and animals, which I think would have come with them living so closely with animals and depending so heavily on them. And it may be that the Neanderthals at Creswell Crags felt exactly the same, but we just haven't found the evidence yet. So we're going to be skipping up to the crags now to find out exactly what they were doing here. Now, it's quite difficult to know what Neanderthals were doing in Britain at any point because the ice sheets covered us periodically, as Angharad was saying earlier. So we have a lot more continuous occupation for Neanderthals on the continent, whereas in Britain, they're in and out. So some of you might have seen the most recent David Attenborough documentary where they were kind of exploiting mammoths, I think in Swindon, about 250,000 years ago. So they're in the country a bit, but then they disappear as the climate changes, and they don't get back up here to the crags until about 60,000 years ago. Now they're living in what we call marine isotope stage 3 at this point, or on the Mammoth steppe. So to paint a picture of what that might have been like, you're thinking about a tundra environment where it's too cold and too dry for lots of trees to grow. So lots of grasses, lots of sedges, and in the winter it could get down, we think, to about -20 degrees with summer highs of a lovely balmy 10. So it sounds pretty chilly, but we had food and water, so the Neanderthals were doing okay. And when we talk about food, obviously there's woolly mammoths if it's called the Mammoth steppe, but we've also got other large megafauna, as Angharad was saying earlier, like woolly rhinos, bison, horses, as well as smaller game and the plants, which of course we now know Neanderthals could have exploited as well. And we know they were here exclusively pretty much through the tools that they were leaving behind to exploit those animals with. So hand axes are possibly the main one. And those of you who are here in person, you'll get to see a real Neanderthal hand axe from the site later on. Hand axes are a really key tool in the Ice Age. They are for your butchery primarily, but they can pretty much be used for anything else apart from killing your animal. So sometimes we call them your Stone Age Swiss Army knife. And they would have been used for chopping up your animal, for taking off the meat, taking off the skins as well to make your clothes and make your tents. So we know Neanderthals were doing all of that sort of thing here. We've also found scrapers from them though, so that indicates hide working and cleaning skins, again suggesting that the Neanderthals here at the crags were making their clothes, bags, tents, anything they needed to out of organic materials. So there's quite a lot going on for them here on the edge of Europe. Now we haven't found any human bones yet though, and this could be for a variety of reasons. Maybe we just haven't looked hard enough, or maybe the Victorians blew them all up when they excavated back in the day. But it could also be that Neanderthals, are doing things with their dead that are now archaeologically invisible. So sometimes they're burying them on the continent, but they're also doing other things with them, like disarticulating them, so scattering them around the landscape, sometimes cannibalizing them, things like that. So they may have been dying here, but we don't have the remains, perhaps because they were scattered throughout the landscape in a slightly different way. Either way, whatever they are doing, they were only coming here for a little bit of the year at a time, so between a few weeks and a few months before they moved off following the animals that they were hunting. And after about 40,000 years ago, they never returned. But that's not the end of our hominin story, because even while they're here, Homo sapiens, or modern humans like ourselves, are sneaking into Europe. And they would come up to the crags a little bit later, but I'll talk about what they were doing on the wider continent before I kind of narrow things down to just this site. Now, modern humans originated in Africa. They evolved about 250,000 years ago as a distinct species. So they're a little bit younger than the Neanderthals. And they actually came out of Africa in a series of migrations, we think. Because originally we thought it was one big wave that came all at once, but actually we have evidence they were kind of coming in and out, trying to break in. The earliest point we think this was happening was about 185,000 years ago, where we find them living in a region of the Middle East called the Levant. And interestingly here, they're living alongside Neanderthals, using characteristic Neanderthal technologies as well. But then they disappear and they disappear back into Africa. And I think that's really fascinating to mention because it shows you just how luck of the draw it is, which species is successful at which time. About 120,000 years ago in the Levant, it was Neanderthals who won out and modern humans who couldn't quite adapt and disappeared back into Africa. And it wasn't really until about 40,000 years ago that you had what we call the successful wave of modern humans coming into Europe, where they colonized the whole continent really, really quickly and where Neanderthals disappear. And it's in that wave where you get that mixing, the genetic mixing, where they are having kids with the Neanderthals, resulting in us and our 2 to 4% DNA signature today. Now, they bring with them some really characteristic technologies that we can use to tell that they're here. So modern humans tend to bring blade tools, which Neanderthals weren't really using. They also brought with them things like elaborate art as well, which Andrea will talk more about in a little bit. And they also bring with them really rich burials. So in contrast to the very sparse burials that Neanderthals have, modern human burials are characteristic and rich. They're very ochred. They've got lots of pigment in. They have a lot of grave goods in. So people generally believed until recently that modern human burial was a lot more symbolic than Neanderthals because it's got more stuff in. But who are we to say what Neanderthal symbolism looked like? Who are we to say that modern human burial was more special because it's got more stuff? Perhaps we're just more materialistic or express our symbolism in a slightly different way. Now, again, here at the Crags, we don't have any human remains from this time period. So we know about modern humans here pretty much exclusively through the tools that they left behind. And actually, they were here twice. Once about 28,000 years ago, during a period of the Paleolithic, which we call the Gravettian. We've got things like our Font Robert point, which we'll show you in the handling collection later on, a nice replica there of the kinds of tools they were leaving behind 28,000 years ago. But they don't leave very much behind then, because Britain is getting very, very cold. And 27,000 years ago, the last glacial maximum happens, where the ice sheets come all the way down across the country and turn Britain into a polar desert, pushing out the humans and the animals. So people don't really return here to Creswell Crags until about 14,000 years ago, when it's slightly warmer. And that's when we have a more continuous occupation and a lot more tools. Now, when they return for that more continuous occupation, it's still very cold. The average July air temperature projected from the time is about 4.4 degrees, so incredibly chilly. You've still got a tundra environment, so still not many trees, but the fauna is a little bit different to what Neanderthals were experiencing. So instead of woolly mammoths and things and woolly rhinos, you've got wild horses, you've also got red deer and lots of Arctic hare exploitation at this time as well. Lots of Arctic hare bones with cut marks on, because we think people were taking them maybe for camouflage in what we would have thought to be quite a snowy environment. We think they were coming here at certain times of year as well, like the Neanderthals, for just a few weeks or months, maybe in the spring and early summer, based on the kinds of faunal remains that we find. Now, they leave behind their toolkits again that help us tell what on earth they were doing. And so they left behind what we call the Creswellian tool industry. And we've got some lovely little replica Creswellian points later, actually named after the site, because we find this style from here and around here in huge abundance. Alongside the flint tools, though, we've also got bone tools that modern humans left behind. So if you head up to our museum later on, you'll see bone spear points. And we've also got awls and needles too, made out of bone. And they would have been used for making clothes and making tents and sorting out your hides. So we can kind of get an idea of the kinds of activities modern humans were undertaking here at the Crags about 14,000 years ago. We also have a couple of other strange materials though. So if you head into the museum, you might see our amber pebble. And that's really interesting because we found that in Robin Hood Cave here. But our closest source of amber is the North Sea coast. So across what would have been Doggerland, which is our land bridge that connected Britain to the continent at this time, kind of along the Denmark, Netherlands coast. So that suggests quite a mobile population coming here to Creswell Crags, or quite wide-ranging trade networks as well. They also, at this time, left behind art too, which I know Andrea is going to talk more about in a second. But that's really, really interesting because the kinds of animals in that art again suggest that people were coming from a long way away. I'll leave Andrea to talk about that in more depth. So maybe the Crags was an aggregation site, possibly for lots of people meeting up at the northernmost fringe of Europe to swap their stories, to find partners, to trade before they moved back off into the rest of Europe for the rest of the year. Now, since I've got to the bit where I'm going to have to try really hard not to talk about art, I'm going to wrap up there. So I hope you've enjoyed your whistle-stop tour of Ice Age people. I know there's a lot more left to say. And so if you do have any questions, please do catch me later. Or if you want me to expound on anything I've said, you can do that too. Thank you very much.
Okay, so welcome everyone. My name is Andrea and I'll be talking about European Ice Age art, which is a really wide topic and we could be here for days just talking about the art. So I'm just going to give a very quick overview of what the art looked like so you can get an idea of different types of art during the Ice Age. We're going to start by talking what is art. Now, there's a good definition as the art is the expression or application of human creative skill and imagination, producing works to be appreciated primarily for their beauty or emotional power. Of course, art is a lot more than that, isn't it? It has different meanings for every one of us. If we look at this art over here, we can see, we recognize what the artists were wanting to tell us with this art over here. We can recognize this as the Last Supper. So we've been raised in a Christian household. We know what that picture means, apart from the beautiful colors and the beautiful imagery. Same thing for Botticelli's The Birth of Venus. If you know something about Greek mythology, you can connect the symbolism of the art with that. And or the Guernica from Picasso with the what was happening in Spain during the Spanish Civil War and what that meant to the people there and what that painting means behind the colors and the pictures. And all of that information is something that we don't have for Ice Age art. We were not there, we can't talk to them. They didn't have any books or anything that can tell us what the art meant to them. So that's what I'm not going to be going much into today because it is impossible. We don't really know. If you see an archaeologist that tells us this is what this art means, don't believe them because we can't tell. This is culture, these are different people. That does mean, though, in a more positive note, is that anything you think of that the art can mean to you could be correct. They are people just like us, so they might think in similar ways. We just will never know the truth or the complete truth of what the art means. So let's start with the origins of art, the oldest art. And for me, this is quite an interesting example. Now, we find this pebble, which is known as probably I'm going to mispronounce it completely, but Makapansgat. Yeah, Makapansgat pebble was found in a cave in Africa. It's not modified or whatsoever, but what we know is that this pebble did not come from that cave. It came from miles away. Some Australopithecus millions of years ago, at the beginnings of our evolution, had seen this pebble and decided to grab it and take it all the way to the cave. We don't really know why, but you can see it's quite a particular pebble. It looks like it may have a face on this pebble over here. Now, this is not made by them. This is not what we would consider art, but it may be the origins of that idea of humans of trying to look for meaning in other things and trying to look for beauty in the world as well, a little bit different than maybe other animals might have done. Hannah mentioned our amber pebble here in the museum. Could the amber pebble ended up in Creswell Crags for a similar reason? Someone back in the Stone Age saw this beautiful, shiny pebble and decided to bring it all the way from Eastern Europe to Creswell Crags with them for whatever reason it was. Like maybe any of you when you were children and saw a shiny little pebble, took it all the way home. And then I had my special magic box full of the little stones I was finding everywhere. That's something very human, isn't it? So I decided to start here. But looking at something more concrete of what the oldest art might be, we go to our next relative, the Homo erectus or Homo heidelbergensis. Now, Hannah didn't mention them before, but Homo heidelbergensis is the one that in Europe will evolve into Homo neanderthalensis, with maybe a Homo antecessor in the middle. And in Africa, Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis evolved into us, Homo sapiens. So a little bit of a misunderstanding that some people have is that Neanderthals evolved into us, and that is not the way. We both evolved from these gentlemen or these over here. And with them, we can start to see a little bit of that origins of trying to make something artistic, something beautiful, something that expresses something to them. We find these beautiful Achillean hand axes, which are perfectly symmetrical on both sides, the belly and the back. They would have required a long time working on them, learning about them, long-term working memory to try and find how the flint works to be able to get the perfect shape. But what is really interesting is that here in Britain, in Wales, in South Wales and in Kent, we find these two hand axes. One has a fossil of a sea urchin in the middle, and another one has the fossil of a shell in the middle. And what's unique about that is that it's making this hand axe weaker. It's making it less functional for the job that the hand axe has. So why make a hand axe with this fossil in the middle? Usually, if you find a fossil in the middle of your tool that is spoiling the strength of your tool, you won't be able to use it anymore. You chuck it away. But these people decided to work around it. It's almost like they're trying to create something that looks beautiful. And with them, we also find some other examples that might be or might not be art. We've got the shell over here where they have made some patterns on the shell. Was it someone just doodling? Was it someone testing their art? We don't really know, but we do have that example over there. That's from Asia. And we have a couple of them from Asia and Africa of these figurines. Now, they have a sort of odd shape that resembles human shape. Of course, they have been quite severely eroded, both of them, but microscopic analysis of both of them have been able to determine that they were modified with human tools. It's not a rock that has a weird shape, it's a rock that we have shaped it on purpose to look this way, to look this anthropomorphic way. So we could consider this the start of art. But archaeologists have been very, very reticent into giving any of these previous species the ability to make art, because until quite recently, that was reserved for us, modern humans. And in a way, it sort of makes sense why they did it, is because with modern humans, if you find one of these, we know eventually it evolved into Michelangelo statues, it evolved into what we have today, and we know that we eventually made art, we had the capacity of art. But because these people became extinct before they could make those amazing work of art, we don't really know if that was the start of art or that was something else. And that brings us to the Neanderthal debate, which Hannah has been talking already about it. We have the myth of the Neanderthal with the more current understanding of Neanderthals look like. And we have a few examples of art that Hannah has been mentioning already. We've got the Crepina necklace over there that Hannah loves. We've got this very interesting sort of henge inside a Neanderthal cave where they broke stalactites on purpose and positioned them in a sort of circular shape. Could that be some sort of artistic monument that we're building already? We have shells with pigments on them, with ochre and holes in them. They may have even used them for necklaces, teeth as well. And this very strange looking rock, which we know they shaped it to look a little bit like it does. And then they placed this bone in the middle of it. So it looks a little bit like a mask or a face. So there is some evidence that they were making symbolic art, that they were making something that had a meaning behind it that is not that clear to us. Now, the thing is, for a long time, archaeologists have been quite reticent to giving that category of art to Neanderthals as well, because again, they had become extinct. But I think now that we know that Neanderthals continue partly on us with that Neanderthal DNA that Hannah mentioned, there's another implication to that. And the implication is that modern humans that met Neanderthals back those thousands of years ago, when they saw Neanderthals, they didn't see them as a different human. They saw them as them, the same as they were. That's why they had relationships. That's why they had children with them. That's why they were living together with them. So why are we insisting still today into trying to find all those little differences between us and Neanderthals when back then we didn't do that? So I'm going to have a look at some of the most recent discoveries of Neanderthal Rockheart, which I think sort of finalizes the debate between Neanderthal and Homo sapiens. Now, the discoveries have been done in the Iberian Peninsula and have been done by a group led by Hoffman. Now, what he did is he has perfected the uranium-thorium dating method, and he decided to test it by going to some caves in Spain where we had found some paint that didn't match the color of the rest of the paint in the cave, or that we thought might be quite old art, and see what the dating result was. And the result was that, well, the dates are from about 60,000 to 50,000 years ago, way before Homo sapiens arrived into the European continent. This art was definitely done by Neanderthals. Now, there has been some criticism on whether it was reliable enough. So I'm going to tell you what their answer was to that criticism, how they have improve their methods. So uranium dating, basically, when those stalactites are being formed, there's flowstone, same way that stalactites form next to the walls of the rock, that's being formed by water coming into the cave, dragging minerals that combine into this new rock. Now, when the water comes in, it still contains uranium, but as it turns into rock, it will slowly change into thorium. So we can check how much uranium and thorium there is in there to be able to date the flowstone. And if it is covering the art, that means the art underneath is going to be older. Yeah. Now, the problem with that is that if flowstone is still going through there, it may drag minerals that are older and sort of muddle the date. So what they've done to be able to surpass that problem is take very, very, very small samples again and again and again and again and again in little layers. That way, if they see a date that is older behind the date, that in front of the date that is newer, they know that this has been compromised. We can't reliably use this date. So they have been very, very careful, and they were doing that all the way to the pigment, so they could get the closest date to the pigment possible. So I think that with that explanation, these dates are we can trust them as much as any of the other dates we have for any of the other rock art. So let's have a look. Now, I have started with Golden Cave, which is not one of those that was dated by Hoffman, but is one that had been dated previously, and it had been dated to about 40,000 years ago. And the only tools that we had in the cave were Neanderthal tools. So the people that discovered the art said, well, maybe Neanderthals made this engraving. And of course, everyone else said, there's no possibility of that because Neanderthals didn't make art. So it must have been Homo sapiens that came after the Neanderthals have been there. So you can see the debate has been going on for a long time. There's a lot of caves where we had found Neanderthal tools with art, and we just assumed the art must have been Homo sapiens because it cannot be Neanderthal. That is not possible. So we probably will be seeing in the future years a lot of reassessment of a lot of the caves. Maybe more Neanderthal art will be found in other places in Europe. Let's look at some of the ones that Hoffman has been able to date. We've got the Cave of Ardales in Andalusia in the south of Spain, and you've got the stalactites that have been covered in this sort of red ochre. Now, this is an interesting case that shows you the debate again. These had been accepted as Homo sapiens art for a very long time, but as soon as Hoffman has come with the dating of Neanderthal, some archaeologists have come up and saying, well, you can't count that as art because it's just coloring the stalactite, can you? So we have that problem again. Now we'll continue then to the next one. Now we've got this one in Cave of La Pasiega, where you've got a panel of handprints on the roof, where you can see them with their hands on the top and all over the walls. One of these hands is the one that has been dated to a Neanderthal handprint. So if you read any articles, any newspapers, they'll say there's one Neanderthal handprint, but I think we can assume that probably quite a lot of these ones also belong to Neanderthals. Now, actually, a lot of the handprints that we find in Europe, like the ones in El Castillo, were one of those caves where they had only found Neanderthal tools around the area where the El Castillo hand panel had been found, and the Castillo hand panel had been dated to over 40,000 years ago. So it was one of those that was debated. Is it Neanderthal? And people had said, well, definitely not, because it can't be Neanderthal. But now we may reassess those ideas. Then the last one we have is the Cave of La Pasiega, which, as you can see in this map over here, it's a cave that is full of art everywhere. We've got Magdalenian art, we've got some that has been made into Solitarian art, Aurignacian, we've got art everywhere. And it's just one of these pieces, this one over here at the very bottom, that has been dated as Neanderthal, which is this one over here. Now, I think this cave brings a really interesting idea. So that if you were living in the Stone Age and you went inside a cave and you found a beautiful picture, you might have added your own as well. And I think that makes a lot of sense, because that's what we've been doing as well in other places. If you go to Stonehenge, you will see those Neolithic axes that they made on the stones. You'll also see runic symbols in there and Latin inscription, and more modern as well. We add to places that we think have some value, we add on top of them. One of the caves I have shown here has a church built on top of it, which it shows as well that sort of continuation. Now, this one here actually had been interpreted to be this cliff that is nearby. It is in sort of a bowl-shaped gorge, which is what they think this bowl-shaped shape might have been. You can see the cliff has sort of these three lines that are sort of depicted there, and they think these dots might have represented the waterfall, which has been given some anthropomorphic features. So it might have been like a goddess of water and things like that. Now, that is, again, we have no idea, but that was one of the interpretations that had been given in the 1800s when it was believed to be Homo sapiens. So I thought I would share it as well. Now, interestingly, though, the animals that you can see in the picture have a different color, and they believed to have been done later on, maybe by modern humans. And what I think is quite interesting is that both of these animals are found in this area. So did some modern humans come to the cave later on and maybe recognize what that meant, if it actually does mean what we think it means? We don't know, might be. Now, let's have a look at modern art, though. Can I have a timing? Just a minute. And we might go a little bit over time. There's a lot to say already. So basically, Upper Paleolithic art is what you will be more familiar with. It's the art that we made here in Europe. You can see the dots in hoods all over the place. We have found it in many, many caves and in many places outside of caves as well. Now, we have divided the art in these 4 different periods, the oldest one being the Aurignacian, the Gravettian, Solutrean, and Magdalenian, which we distinguish by different dates, different tools, and different styles. Now, I'm not going to be concentrating on these dates, though, because like I've mentioned, a lot of the caves we have found, like if you go to Chevalski Cave, you find some styles that match Magdalenian, some styles that matches Gravettian, some that matches Aurignacian. So I don't think a lot of the caves are from one time period and one date all done at the same time, but it might be a project of many different generations, many different people collaborating in the cave. So instead, I'm going to talk about I'm going to show you the arts that we find and show you what it looked like and different techniques that they used. So I'm going to start with the handprints just because they seem to be one of the oldest forms of art. And we can see them all over the place. We have them in Gargas, in several caves in France. We have them in El Castillo, and we have them in other continents as well. So it seems to be a very popular form of art. It's almost like leaving your mark in the cave. Now, the way they made these handprints is by using liquid paint, probably inside their mouth, and spitting it through a piece of bone so they could splatter it all around their hands. Now, if you do that, if you think about when you're doing your hand stencil around your hand, you're going to leave a larger hand than your hand actually is. And some archaeologists have actually used that to try and guess who was leaving these handprints. And what's quite interesting is that a lot of them, a lot more than they thought of, belonged to very young children, about 2 to 10 years old. Some of them wouldn't have been able to blow the paint, so probably their parents would have had them. So this was probably something they did in a group, part of their community, communal activity. We can also see over there Leroy Gorham's ideas of why some of the handprints are missing fingers. A lot of hunter-gatherer societies today have bimodal bilingual language. What that means is that they use their voice to speak, but they also use hand signals. If you think about it, that's going to be very useful for a hunter-gatherer society, because we don't want to be talking while we're hunting. We have to be very, very quiet. So could these handprints mean something to us? And the archaeologists looking at all the different handprints, see if they can figure out a code, a message that they have left for us as well. So their world as well, and we have to consider that, was a completely different world that it is today. Their world is a zoocentric world. If you went outside, you would be surrounded by herds of animals. Hyenas lived in clans of about 100 animals, while we humans lived in groups of about 20 to 30 people. We may have gathered sometimes in bigger groups of up to 100 people, but there's some studies saying that about 70,000 years ago, there was a crisis in our populations, and we went under almost to 1,000 people in the whole planet. So that means that there's going to be a lot more animals around you than the amount of people that you're going to see. Completely different. We can't even imagine what the world would have been like. So maybe because of that, it makes sense that the most popular art they make are different animals. So I'm going to just go through them quite quickly. We've got a bison, that one over there with the big beard, and we've got aurochs. We've got different types of bison and aurochs, but let's have a look at the art. Now, you may have seen some of these, they're quite popular. This one is the one in Lascaux. That one is from Lascaux again. So we've got aurochs and bisons from Lascaux. We've got the bisons from Altamira. Now, for the paint for these ones, they have used natural pigments like ochre, hematite, magnet, as you would find already in the caves themselves. So most of the minerals they would get from local sources and just used as they had. If they didn't have any pigments, they could use other techniques. You can see there are sculptures almost over there of these bisons here, or this bas relief over here where they've formed the rock to make the shape of the animal, or just drawing with a burin into the rock if the rock is soft enough. And that one is ours from Creswell Crags, which uses the drawing the animal technique, but we also use, like in Altamira, the shape of the cave to give the impression that the bison is coming out of the rock, to almost give this life to the animals. And that's probably something that they did, something that they did quite often in art. But if you think about it, back in hunter-gatherer societies, observational skills are very, very important. They're going to mean life or death in many, many situations. So maybe it was a way of training your eyes, trying to see shapes into the rock, or maybe it just happened naturally to them. Their skills of observation were so good that as they went into a cave, they would see these shapes everywhere. Now, the deer is also a really, really popular animal in cave art, and we've got many different types of deers. We've got the Irish elk of the Megaloceros with the 2-meter length antlers. We've got reindeers and red deer stacks. Now, reindeers and red deer stacks are one of the most popular animals that they consume, so it does make sense that they are depicted in the art, even though the art that we find in the caves usually doesn't reflect what they're eating there. So that's also an idea. So we've got the Megaloceros here from Lascaux. We've got over here, you can see there a little bit better, a couple of drinking reindeers. We've got our red deer stack from Creswell Crags, another reindeer from Lascaux. And we've got, you can see they're all sort of different styles, different shapes, different cultures, different times as well. So they don't all look the same. Now then, we've got our Chevalski Host. This is the horse that would be the closest to what horses in the Stone Age look like. They were stockier, smaller, a little bit like ponies. And you can see that reflected in the art as well. Is a bas-relief frieze that you can have in one of the caves, and you can almost see them running through the rock. They play a little bit with these illusions as well of movement. Now we can see this one over here is from Peshmel, and the whole horses over here has been done with the blowing technique I was mentioning earlier of the handprints. There's an experimental archaeologist that has reconstructed the whole thing to see how they did it, and he mentions how the lines could be known by putting your hand flat and blowing on top of it, and then the dots, doing stencils with leather and then blowing in the dots. And then we've got the famous ones, the woolly mammoth and the woolly rhinoceros as well. And we have them here in caves like Ruffignac. Here we can see them that they painted them and engraved them as well. So they use both different techniques here. And then we've got some predators. Predators are not as popular as the herbivores. Maybe because they didn't have as close as a relationship with them as they did with some of the herbivores that they would have hunted and consumed. But we do find a few of them. We've got a few strange ones in Le Trophée cave in France, has a lot of palimpsests of humans and animals mixed. And this one seems to be a bear that has a lot of spears stuck to it, so it's sort of throwing up blood there, and it's got spots like a leopard or a hyena, so it's got a strange sort of mixture. Then there's that bear with the head of a wolf over there as well, so it's another strange sort of mixture. We've got a bear and some lions and hyenas from Chauvet Cave as well. And then finally, some rarer ones that we don't find as often. We've got some birds and fish and other animals that they would have connections with. Now, quite interestingly, birds are not very common in Rockheart. Because Hannah, I mentioned just because Hannah was talking about Neanderthals' use of birds, they seem to have fallen by the wayside by the time modern humans are around. There is some more depictions of birds in portable art, but we have a few as well in caves. We've got the black ox over here. We've got this one, it's the ibis from Creswell Crags, which they've done it a little bit on that bas-relief style of removing the rock instead of engraving into the rock. And that one over there is the owl from Chauvet Cave. Has a completely different technique that we see as well in other caves, where they use their own fingers. If the cave is soft enough, you can scratch into the rock and use your fingers to make the art. And we find as well some strange sort of lines. And again, experimental archaeologists have tried to measure who was making these lines. And there's, I think it is in Ruffignac, where they did some analysis of these strange symbols on the ceiling, and they figure out 7 different people made them, and some of them were again children between 2 and 5 years old, and because they're on the ceiling, they can imagine someone holding them up while they're just scratching on the ceiling, making these little symbols and silhouettes. And then we've got the one bird in Lascaux, very tiny, next to that man that seems to not have be having a very successful hunt. And then we've got a couple of fish as well from the Abri du Poisson, which means the cave of the fish. So you've got, you can see that's a salmon over there, but you can see all these little drill holes all around it. This is, as far as I know, the only piece of rock art inside a cave that was on the cave that has had an attempt on thieving. Someone tried to steal it in the middle of the night, but I think they decided to stop, maybe because they were finding that removing the whole rock might actually destroy the engraving. But you can still see their attempt with all these little drill holes they drilled all around it. So even Rockheart, someone will try to steal it. This will be our next Mona Lisa. But then we go to our human representations, which are even rarer than animals. Like I said, it's a zoocentric world. It might be that's just the reason. There's some people that think that maybe like with early photograph, they might have think that drawing humans, it was part of drawing your soul. So you may not have wanted to do that. We do have a lot of symbols that have identified as human body parts. But we do have a few human representations that are quite realistic, like these ones over here from La Manche. And I love this because they show you that these are all different people with different hairstyles. They have short hairstyles and long hairstyles, not crazy tangled hair that you can see sometimes in movies. I did press that by mistake. And then you can see some hairs, you can see beards. I love this chap over here with a little goatee coming out. So you've got a lot of different styles, people, and personalities as well in the Stone Age. You've got a few other human depictions over here. These ones are quite interesting because they show us children, babies as well. That one over there, you can see there's like a female figure and then a tiny little figure that might be a little baby, maybe on the back of the woman, showing how they would carry their babies. And this one over here is called the birth. Now, I really hope that no one gave birth in this way, but you can see what is the abstract image of a person. You have quite a few in this cave. And then this little person coming out of them at the back. A lot of the humans in Cave of Los Casares, which is where this one comes from in Spain, have animals linked to all the people. And in this one, you have the horse. So we don't know if it's a type of ritual or connection between animals and human events, but there we go. And the last one over there is again from that strange cave of the three brothers of Trophée, where we've got an anthropomorphic figure with a lot of animal characteristics. We've got some deer, some lions, some owl, a little bit of everything in that one, another palimpsest of human design and animals. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about how they would see the art, because they would see the art completely different than what we see it in these caves with these candles and torches, their shadows reflecting. Marcus Zima and Florence Riviere have done this study on the art, especially in Chauvet, as it could have been used almost like a proto-paleo cinema, where someone's telling the story and with the lights moving, you can see the movement of the animals. And in Chauvet Cave, you can see quite well, almost like a scene happening over here. You can imagine someone creating that illusion for people listening or looking at the images. And another sort of optical illusion is these strange things that we find in, especially in France, called rondelles, which were originally thought to be buttons. They might have been used as matons. They may have been used for other things. But an interesting thing is that they start making images on each side that seem to tell the story. And this one from the Camois is quite an interesting one, because when you spin it like a thaumatrope, you can see the deer running, the legs moving back and forth. You've got this optical illusion that they've been playing with. Now, I will finish though with this slide, which is our world outside of the caves, because even though we think of Stone Age people as cave people, they didn't live in caves most of the time. If they lived in caves, it would be rock shelters, small little chambers like the ones we have here, Creswell Crags, that are going to be dry and light and comfortable to live in. But if you think about those caves, you may have gone to one of those caves in the Peak District, or that one you can go on a boat. Caves tend to be wet, damp and cold and very, very dark. Not a nice place to live in. They sometimes went in and made some of their art, but most of the time they lived in rock shelters or outdoors. So probably a lot of their art was also portable art or art that they made outside of the cave that may not have survived as well. I've got a few examples over here of some portable art, the Venus figurines, which are quite common. I have put a lot of different ones because sometimes we've got a viewing of one of them. The Venus of Willendorf is quite famous, and it gives the idea that all the Venus figurines look like that. But you can see in here that they had different body shapes. Some of them had clothes, some didn't. You have many different types of Venus figurines or female figures. You also have some other different figures. They may have been, again, for rituals, they may have been children toys. One of the Venus figurines, they found the fingerprint of a child on it. So we may be thinking of meanings for all of those things that go further than what they were meant to be. And you also have art on their tools, like the atlatls or spear throwers over here. Now, I've got an example there of one of their huts. This one is covered in reindeer furs. You've got one that they tested covered in reindeer in leather, you know, in case it's a rainy day, you can have your waterproof version. And you've got the evidence from the site in Germany, in Russia, of the mammoth huts, where they used pieces of mammoth bones, the tusks, the hip bones, the scapulas, to build these huts, which would have been quite nice big huts for them to live in. So that may have been what their homes look like. Okay, so do we have any? Should we do any questions?
Okay, so the only questions we've got so far are for Hannah. So what were Neanderthals and Homo sapiens wearing to keep warm in those temperatures, and what evidence is there of that clothing?
So in terms of Neanderthal and modern human clothing, because obviously it's made of skins and furs, so organic materials, we don't really find direct evidence of it. So we have to use what we call indirect evidence, and that's looking at the kinds of technologies they would have been using to work hides, but also to sew things together. So for modern humans, you get a lot of needles. So like I was saying, we've got our bone needles upstairs. They come from exclusively modern human contexts. So we don't find any Neanderthal sewing technologies as such. And you'd also find awls as well, which are a piercing technology that we find for modern humans too. So we're pretty sure they were making what we call complex clothing, which is basically clothes that look like what we wear today, but made out of skin and fur. For Neanderthals, though, it's a little bit more complex because, like I said, we don't find those needle technologies. So people have originally thought, kind of playing off that Neanderthal bias again, that they couldn't make proper clothes, that maybe they were only draping a couple of furs over themselves, and that would do. But actually, when you look at their biology and the kinds of temperatures they would have been facing, that doesn't really work, especially if they're living quite a physical lifestyle where they're having to move around a lot, run after animals, etc. They really need proper tailored clothing, or at least I think they do. And so it's important to remember that there are other ways as well of manufacturing seams and sewing. They would have had access to sharp bone splinters, to sharp flint splinters, which they could have used for piercing. We know they had string technologies as well, so they had the ability to sew. And we know they were working hides and cleaning things, probably for clothing. So we have all of these materials, we just don't have the actual needle technologies, but it doesn't mean they couldn't pierce and they couldn't sew, just in slightly different ways to how we envision sewing today. There's actually a really interesting new piece of research I just want to flag up, whereby people were looking at using adhesives as potential for Neanderthal seam construction. So we know they could make birch bark tar, which was their kind of glue, and we know they use that to stick tools together. But actually, you can use glue to make clothes today, and potentially you may have been able to use glue to glue seams together for Neanderthals, and they would actually be waterproof seams as well, which would have been really valuable in the kind of snowy temperatures and environments they would have been living in. So yeah, lots and lots of new research still to be done. But
I have a question related to that one, because we know the environment changed quite a lot after Neanderthals became extinct. It became a lot more glacier, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So there's going to be a lot less trees and wood around. So you'd want to make your needles out of bone. Is there
Yeah.
any possibility that maybe Neanderthals were making needles out of other materials like wood?
Well, that's an excellent point, Andrea, because I forgot to mention that, but I did toy with this as an idea for a dissertation at one point. So I did a bit of research on it. And actually, yeah, there are hunter-gatherer groups in certain parts of the world that do make needles out of wood or really sharp thorns, for example. And they work really well, especially if you've worked your hide enough so it's nice and soft. So we may well have had Neanderthal needles made out of organic materials that are now missing. So I don't think we can say they didn't wear complex clothing. I think they would have had to. I think they maybe made it slightly differently to how modern humans did, though. Thank you.
So we'll give Hannah a break because we've got a question for Andrea. What tools would they have used to paint and engrave with?
That's a very good question. So for engraving, we think that the tool they would have used most often is the burin, which we've got over here, but it's basically a flake of flint that has a pointy end, so you can basically scrape onto the rock to make the lines. For those friezes that we see, or the ivies here, Creswell Crags, we think they would have used the burin combined with an antler hammer to sort of chisel the rock away to create those sort of sculptures. Some of the rock, like I mentioned, was soft enough so they could use their own fingers or hands to make those drawings. Now for the paints, like I mentioned already, the blowing technique, they would also have mixed their paint with like their rock pigments with other materials like blood, fat, animal fat, and other materials to make it quite thick, so it would stick onto the rock. And then they could have applied it either with their own hands, or we think that they may have also used paintbrushes made out of bristles made out of reindeer fur or other animal fur, so very similar to what we use today. And they can tell that from the if you look at the paint like you do today with art, you can see the brush stroke, you can see the splutter, the different techniques, dotting techniques that they may have used to color some of their art. And they could have also used the pigments themselves directly onto the rock like a crayon. So charcoal especially, you can use it quite directly, but most of that probably wouldn't have survived very well because mixing it with other materials really is quite important for it to stick onto the rock. We have one for you.
No. So we do have some questions still online, but does anyone in the room have any questions as well? Yeah.
I have a question about the Ice Age, and what is the latest theory as to why the various Ice Ages occurred?
That was definitely.
Oh, thank you. So for those online, if you didn't hear, that question was about what is the latest theory about why the Ice Ages occurred. Okay, I'm going to have to think back to my master's now, which was 9 years ago. So one of the largest causes in terms of the climatic changes are changes in the sort of the Earth's orbit. So sometimes the Earth sort of wobbles on its axis. Sometimes the orbit of the Earth changes from more circular to more elliptical, and that sort of affects like the distribution of the sun's rays over the surface and therefore how warm it is. And then there's also knock-on effects of that in terms of today we've got sort of the what's it called, the warm water that goes through the North Atlantic. Yes, we've got the Gulf Stream. But if you have sort of melting ice as it warms up, then the ice can sort of cut off the Gulf Stream or the thermohaline circulation that can then make temperatures a bit colder. So there's all sorts of like various interactions and knock-on effects and amplifications and then reversals. Yeah, I can't say any more detail than that.
Even things like the volcanoes that can cause the little ice ages, and one of the reasons why they think human populations go down very, very low 70,000 years ago is because of the eruption of the volcano Tava, I think it is, which causes the cooling of the earth as well and very harsh temperatures and climate change.
Yeah, I guess even in like 1991 we had the eruption of Mount Pinatubo, and that sort of
there was the one as well during Henry VIII era, which was the Little Ice Age, and you may have heard of the Thames fairs where you could actually go on top of the Thames because it would freeze completely, and they have a fair on top of the Thames, and that's during that period of the Little Ice Age, which was caused, I think, by an Icelandic volcanic eruption. I can't remember. That's medieval.
Here. Okay, one more on Zoom and then we'll come back to the room. So we've got a question about sort of the care. There's evidence of care for the sick and disabled of Neanderthals. Do we have any knowledge of Neanderthals' lifespan?
Yeah, there is really cool evidence for anybody in the room who didn't know this about that Neanderthals were caring for their sick and injured. We find a lot of Neanderthals with traumas on their skeletons who live to quite old ages. So the kind of uppermost age we find, and Andrea can correct me if I'm wrong on this, is sort of around 50, but I believe it gets quite difficult to specify ages after you get to about 50. So they could be older, but we get them living to sort of 50 plus and caring for people long enough that they get to that age. Is that right?
There's a little bit of a point to make, because when we talk about lifespans, the average lifespan that we usually give is from people when they are born. So when you hear that an average lifespan is about 30 years old, it's because when a child is born, 30 years old is the lifespan at the moment, the average lifespan. But as soon as that person turns into their 20s, or even when they turn 4 or 5, their lifespan sort of doubles because you've passed sort of the most dangerous part of that life. So they could have lived, today hunter-gatherers live up to their 70s and 80s. In their 70s is when they start having more complex issues that would have needed more serious medical attention that we can offer today that may not have been able to offer back then. But if anyone is interested in more things about medicine, I can plug my medicine talk, which is in Patreon.
Well, yeah, hopefully that answered your question. But the only other point to make with that is, of course, we don't find a lot of Neanderthal dead. So the kind of amount that we do have tells us that certain Neanderthals were living to 50 plus, but we may be missing bodies, and there may be a lot more elderly Neanderthals that we don't know about.
They
so
seem to be burying quite a lot of children as well. Children seem to be the ones that Neanderthals choose to bury in the caves more often, which of course skews our view of Neanderthals as well. So we may think that they die younger, but they may have chosen to do something different with other people depending on their lifestyle or the place they are in their life.
Yeah, thank you.
Do you think that there would be people specialized in making art in those Ice Age hunter-gatherer societies?
Yeah, there's quite a lot of really interesting studies about that. Some archaeologists have looked at the style of the art, and because some of the art in some of the caves is very homogeneous, very similar, they think it might have been the same artist making all those figures of art. It could also be that it was cultural. So if you think about Egyptian art, it stays very much the same for a very long time on style and way of doing it. And that's because how they make the art and what it looks like is part of their culture as well. There's another very interesting study, which I found really interesting. The presentation is off, but is by Penny Spikings, who works at University of York. She's been doing this project looking at hidden depths, things that we're starting to look at in Stone Age people. And one of the things she's been looking at is at neurodiversity in the Stone Age. And she compared the art of children and adults in the autism spectrum with some of the art, especially in particular the art in Chauvet, where you could see those animals like the lions and the horses that seem to have been deconstructed to different parts of the animal. And it seems to be quite similar. So she proposed that maybe some people in the autism spectrum that had a special role in those societies, which would have been quite relevant, because especially like I was mentioning about observational skills being really, really important. We can see people in the autism spectrum today in hunter-gatherer societies being really important for those communities for those particular skills. And it was maybe that the people making the art were on the spectrum, or maybe probably because back then people had better observational skills because they had to train them from infancy. That's where the similarity of the art comes from. So we can't confirm that is one person or one type of people doing all of the art. We have looked at those handprints to try and see who's making the art. And what we can definitely see is that the handprints are from a lot of different sizes. They are children, they're women, they're men. It is not a gender specific role. Even if you look at old Stone Age books, especially that come from Victorian studies, you'll always see the men making the art and the men making the tools and the men going to hunt and the men doing everything. And they're not good at multitasking, are they? No. So what we do know is that definitely everyone could take part in the art in their community. And it does seem a lot of children did take part as well. So I think that makes it more of a communal activity, but it could be that some of the arts, some people specialize in some of the art. One of the ladies I showed as well, the Dolny Vestinici, we've got quite a lot of evidence of portable art in a couple of burials we have there. And one of them is this mask of this woman with her face seems to go a little bit more to one side, sort of asymmetrical. So archaeologists think that that is not a symbolic depiction of a woman, but that is actually a real woman, that is a portrait. And she has been called the shaman of Dolny Vestinici or the artist of Dolny Vestinici. And some archaeologists think that she may be the one behind the art, not only because we've got this mask, but we also have a more rough sketch of the same face in there that it has been considered maybe it was an apprentice or someone trying to learn hair skills and maybe trying to draw their master, but not as skillfully as she may have done. But who knows? We don't really know.
Okay, one final question for Hannah. Talking about the sort of the evidence of food in their teeth, do you know what sort of plants they would have eaten, Neanderthals, I think?
Very good question. So I believe the material that we found in some of the dental calculus, there is evidence for mosses, grasses. We've got evidence for mushrooms as well. And certainly at Alcedron, again, Andrea can correct me if I'm wrong on this, we've got medicinal plants too in their calculus, so yarrow and chamomile. And one of the mushrooms, I believe, was of the penicillin variety and was ingested by one of the Neanderthals who had a dental abscess. So possibly self-medicating with very early antibiotics. So maybe move over Alexander Fleming. Perhaps Neanderthals actually discovered penicillin. But we also get a little bit of kind of outside of the teeth, shall we say, evidence for plant consumption too, if we're just talking about plant consumption. So at some sites you find other grass seeds and nuts as well that they would have been consuming. So as well as the plant material in the dental calculus, there is sometimes in the right preservation conditions preserved kind of plant materials that they also would and could have been eating.
Okay. Okay, so that's all the questions, I think. So one thing to do before we sort of break for lunch is just to do a bit of plugging of our online talks on Patreon. So we have online talks at 6 p.m. every other Monday, and they're on a variety of topics. So I'm actually doing one tomorrow evening. And then we also have a Patreon account. So I'm just going to put 2 links in the chat box here. But for those in the room,
Hannah, do you want
just
to open them on that laptop?
Yeah, or for those in the room.
The chart, you're going to see the link that Angharad just shared, so you just can press on them so they can see.
Or you can just Google Creswell Crags Eventbrite and Creswell Crags Patreon. And our Patreon account is one we have, it's basically a library of all our online talks, basically a year of online talks. We've got over 30 talks in there on a myriad of sort of Ice Age archaeology and paleontology. Andrea's done some, I've done some. We've got various guest speakers like Chris Stringer and Rob Dinnis and loads of high profile academics. So do check that out if you're interested in our Patreon or our future online talks on Eventbrite.
Angharad, what's your talk tomorrow about?
It's on Creswell Crags collections, although the tickets have gone off sale now, so it's too late. But I'm doing another one in 2 weeks' time about cold adapted animals. Okay, so I think for those online, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for all the questions. And for those in person, we're going to break for lunch now. So thank you very much, everybody.